The word hermitage is known to every educated person. Originally it was a French word, but today, surprisingly enough, people in the world associate it with Russia. For a long time it has been the symbol of Russian culture, a well-deserved honor, because the Hermitage stands for the largest museum in Russia and one of the richest and most famous in the world. Like a great storehouse of space and time, it carefully preserves nearly 3 million exhibits, representing different epochs. The Hermitage is renowned not only for its celebrated collections. The museum's worldwide fame is shared by its buildings, forming an unrivaled ensemble in one of the most beautiful sites of St. Petersburg. Outstanding among the Hermitage buildings is the amazingly grandiose and luxuriously decorated Winter Palace, built in 1762 for Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter I, according to the design of the Italian architect Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli. As much as 7 years had passed before this grand construction project was finalized. Nearly 2,500 masons were simultaneously engaged in stonework. In order to glaze all the rooms, 23,000 glass panes were installed. The total number of rooms in this palace exceeds 460. Everything is decorated with supreme magnificence, wrote Rastrelli, pointing out that he was building the palace solely for the glory of the whole Russian Empire. This building was destined to serve for 150 years as the principal residence of Russian emperors, thus turning into a specific symbol of the great empire. Its architecture strikingly blends ample Russian audacity with perfect European order. Enormous proportions with airy lightness, joyous festive splendor with barely perceptible pensiveness, typical of St. Petersburg. While its outer look remained unchanged, the palace had several fundamental reconstructions inside to keep pace with the fashion and the tastes of its inhabitants. Magnificent decorations of the interior were designed by the best architects working in Russia in different times: Quarengi, Rinaldi, Starov, Veltin, and Valin de la Mothe in the 18th century, and Montferrand, Rossi, Stasov, Bryullov, and Stackenschneider in the 19th. During the reign of Catherine II, new buildings of the small and large hermitages were raised next to the palace, while the construction of the Hermitage Theatre went underway. Consequently, a whole ensemble of palace edifices grew on the banks of the Neva, with the Winter Palace rightfully dominating over the others. In 1837, the palace suffered a devastating catastrophe. On the 17th of December, a malfunction of the heating system caused a conflagration of such force that the fire could not be extinguished for 36 hours. Eyewitnesses compared the flaming palace with an erupting volcano. The inner furnishing of the residence was all but utterly destroyed. Fortunately, and above all by the incredible effort and heroism of soldiers, the remaining buildings of the palace ensemble and the imperial art collections were saved. Immediately after the fire, a plan was developed to revive the main palace of Russia as quickly as possible. It was implemented under the leadership of the outstanding Russian architects Vasily Stasov and Alexander Bryulov by a whole army of builders, woodworkers, stonecutters, artificers, glaziers, gilders, and the major part of the Winter Palace was restored in 15 months. The splendid ambassadorial staircase leads to the gala rooms of the Winter Palace. It is by these stairs that foreign guests of high rank ascended to meet Russian emperors. In the 19th century, this staircase was also named Jordanian, because, during the celebrations of Epiphany, members of the imperial family descended it to the frozen Neva, where an ice hole, a Jordan, had been made to perform a water consecration ritual. Restoration works in the ceremonial part of the Winter Palace were headed by the architect Stasov. In the staircase, he endeavoured to preserve the brilliant elegance of Rastrelli's Baroque style. The white marble steps and banisters, the intricate gilded moulding, the massive mirrors, and the majestic statues glorifying fair and wise governance, as well as the picturesque plafond with Olympic gods by the Italian artist Gasparo Tiziani, fill up the vast volume of the Jordanian staircase with a feeling of merry exultation. It is restrained solely by the strict rhythm of the mighty grey granite columns. Two lines of gala suites diverge directly from the upper landing. Peter's Memorial Room is dedicated to the memory of Peter the Great, founder of St. Petersburg and the first Russian emperor. The room's walls are draped with red French velvet. Embroidered with silver threads upon the velvet are the images of two-headed eagles, the monogram of Peter I, and plant ornaments. The combat scenes of the Battle of 1708 near the village of Lesnaya and the Battle of Poltava 1709 celebrate the glorious victories of the Russian forces during the Northern War against Sweden. In the center of the room, inside a deep niche, there's a portrait by the Italian maestro Jacopo Amiconi. The emperor is depicted standing on the seashore beside Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and patroness of military leaders. Mounted on the dais are the throne chair from the times of Paul I and the footstool. The room's decor is supplemented with silver consoles and floor lamps, wooden parquetry of intricate pattern, and grisaille-style paintings on the ceiling. In Peter's room, foreign diplomats traditionally presented their compliments for the new year to the Russian emperor. The armorial hall is always flooded with the light emitted by the shining gilding. The name of this room, the second largest in the Winter Palace, is connected with its decoration abundant in coats of arms of Russia's provinces and the cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Once, escutcheons with heraldic emblems adorned the sculptured groups of warriors, clad in old Russian garments at the frontal walls. Presently, the pictures of coats of arms may be found only on the numerous gilded chandeliers. The armorial hall was intended for formal receptions in honor of the delegates representing provincial nobility. Besides, the members of the imperial family would walk in a ceremonial procession through this very room, heading to the great church of the Winter Palace. On such memorable days, the bypass gallery of the armorial hall was crowded with the invited public and representatives of the press. An honorific place in the Winter Palace belongs to the famous War Gallery, glorifying the victory of Russian forces in the Patriotic War of 1812. Displayed on its walls are the portraits of 332 generals, participants in the battles with the French. 10 years of titanic work, accomplished by the English artist George Dorr and his Russian assistants Vasily Golika and Alexander Polyakov, resulted in a unique memorial immortalizing those unforgettable events. The making of the gallery started in 1819. By that time, many of the generals had already passed away. Besides, some of their families had no portraits of the heroes. To commemorate their deeds, 13 empty frames were covered in green fabric, with a name and military rank under each of them. The portraits of the War Gallery represent the elite of the Russian army of the 19th century. Field Marshals Mikhail Kutuzov and Michael Barclay de Tolly, Generals Bagration, Platov, Yermolov, Rayevsky, Vorontsov and many others. The formal equestrian portrait of Emperor Alexander I, with the city of Paris in the background, was made by the German painter Franz Krüger. The War Gallery precedes the St. George or Throne Hall. Its grandiose size, combined with the noble purity of snow-white Carrara marble and the radiance of gilded bronze, add particular solemnity to the decor of the palace's main chamber. An important detail of the hall's design is the unique copper counter-ceiling covered with gilded ornamentation. Its tracery reflects, as in an enormous mirror, the pattern of the parquet floor made from 16 rare species of wood. In the place of the monarch's seat, restored in 2000, stands a throne draped with velvet and adorned with gilded silver. It was made in 1831 by the English craftsman Clausen for Empress Anna Ioannovna. The carved arms of the throne chair terminate in sculpted eagle heads. The legs are shaped in the likeness of mighty claws holding gilded spheres. The coat of arms of the Russian Empire is embroidered in silver on its back and replicated on a scarlet background behind the throne. Above the throne seat, there is a marble bas-relief representing St. George the Victorious, patron of the Russian state and the Russian army. The Neva suite of the Winter Palace opens with the antechamber, designed in calm, light colours. The walls, faced with artificial marble of yellowish hue, are in harmony with the gilding on the ceiling. The plafond, the sacrifice of Iphigenia, was made by Jacopo Guarano, a Venetian artist. The monumental temple rotunda in the center of the antechamber, with its malachite columns and sumptuous adornments of gilded bronze, is a masterpiece by the famous French sculptor Pierre-Philippe Thomure. Made in the first half of the 19th century, the rotunda was ordered by the Demidovs, owners of the Ural mining plants, and has been kept in the Hermitage since 1958. The interior of the concert hall emanates peace and harmony. This room, decorated with sculptures of the Grecian muses, was generally used to give concerts to the imperial family members and accommodate small concert balls for a limited circle of invited guests. Today, visitors to the concert hall can observe an exhibit unusual for a ceremonial chamber, the tomb of Alexander Nevsky. The remains of the saint and blessed prince, the heavenly patron of St. Petersburg, were transferred from Vladimir to the northern capital in 1724. They still rest at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. In the middle of the 18th century, following the decree of Empress Elizabeth, a magnificent tomb was made at the St. Petersburg Mint from 1,500 kilograms of pure Transbaikal silver to encase the relics of Alexander Nevsky. In 1922, when this splendid masterpiece of Russian arts and crafts was under the threat of remelting, the scientific and cultural circles of Petrograd succeeded in their efforts to deliver the tomb to the Hermitage. At the very center of the solemn ensemble, a multi-tier pyramid is raised with the image of Alexander Nevsky on the background of ermine robes. At both sides of the pyramid, the figures of angels are holding cartouche plates with engraved texts praising the Saint and Blessed Prince and Empress Elizabeth. A sarcophagus rests at the base of the pyramid, its walls bearing bas-reliefs with scenes from the life of Alexander Nevsky. The tomb is supplemented with pedestals for military arms and tall incense-burning censers. In 1763, the great church of the Winter Palace was consecrated in the name of the icon of the Saviour not made by hands. Here, the baptismal and wedding rituals were held for the members of the Tsar's family, as well as ceremonial divine services traditionally accompanying all formal events at the Russian court. While restoring the church after the fire of 1837, the architect Vasily Stasov attempted to preserve its original Baroque ornamentation, designed by Rastrelli. The vigorously dynamic architectural forms, the glistening gilt and monumental paintings, everything here is merged into a single chord, praising God. The composition is completed by the plafond representing the resurrection of Christ. The Memorial Alexander's Hall is the only gala room in the Winter Palace that overlooks the Palace Square. The hall is dedicated to Emperor Alexander I and Russia's victory over France in the Patriotic War of 1812. Designed by the architect Alexander Brulov, it was opened in 1839. The decor of Alexander's Hall is a vivid example of different architectural styles successfully harmonized. The clustered columns of Gothic character are matched here with gently sloping cupolas, resembling Byzantine ones. The ceilings and arches are covered with moulding, reflecting the traditions of classicism. The sculptured war trophies decorate the fireplaces. On the frontal wall of the hall, there's a medallion with the profile of Alexander I. The emperor impersonates here a Slavonic god, the warrior sage Radomysl. At the juncture of the northern and western buildings of the Winter Palace, there is an unusually shaped room. It is the rotunda. The room owes its name to the Italian word rotondo, which means round. The first rotunda in the Winter Palace was built in the 1830s by the French architect Auguste de Montferrand. This design of his was inspired by the domed circular temples of ancient Rome. After the fire of 1837, the interior of the rotunda was restored by Alexander Bryulov. He raised the dome of the room considerably, making it, according to one of his contemporaries, lofty and bold. The broad band of the balcony gently envelops the perfectly round space of the room. Natural illumination streams through the skylight. A majestic pattern shines on the polished floor, as if reflected in a gigantic mirror. The rotunda is connected with the dark corridor. Daylight never comes here. Its walls, partitioned by mighty Doric columns, are covered with West European tapestry of the 16th and 17th centuries. The great art of tapestry making originated in medieval Western Europe. Tapestries were never designed or made as isolated works of art. They were produced in series to decorate a certain room. Hung closely in a row, they entirely covered the walls and the doors. The tapestry making process was divided into several stages. First of all, artists, sometimes quite famous ones, made a preliminary sketch. Then the sketches were enlarged to the size of future tapestries, and the resulting images were placed into broad looms under uncoloured wool threads of the warp. Interweaving the warp threads with variegated thinner ones of the woof, weavers managed to copy the composition on the image. Depending on the intricacy of work, One craftsman made from 2 to 4 square meters of tapestry a year. Thus, tapestry production was indeed a collective art. Presently, the Winter Palace retains only part of its magnificent array of residential apartments that once occupied considerable space in the huge building. On the 16th of April 1841, Alexander Nikolaevich, heir to the throne, the future Emperor Alexander II, wed the Gessen-Darmstadt princess. The future Empress Maria Alexandrovna, who received on that day the titles Grand Duchess and Crown Princess, settled in the rooms assigned to her on the first floor of the palace's northwestern part. She resided in these apartments until her death in 1880. The residential quarters of Maria Alexandrovna consisted of 8 rooms. Some of them have preserved their interior up to the present time. The boudoir, or the small study, was one of the favourite rooms of Maria Alexandrovna. It was designed in the middle of the 19th century by the architect Gerald Buss in the second Rococo style, fashionable at the time. The atmosphere of this room gives the impression of a fairy tale. Quaint patterns are wound into an intricate configuration. Shimmering gilt outlines the slender semi-figures of snow-white caryatids. A splendid bronze chandelier is reflected in variously shaped mirrors. Maria Alexandrovna spent a lot of her spare time in her cosy boudoir, reading, writing letters to her relatives, or having tea with her husband. A door opened from here to the stairs leading down to the rooms of her children on the ground floor. In the large or crimson study, designed by Andrei Steckenschneider, the Empress received her personal guests and met the members of the imperial family. This study also served as an informal music salon. The pattern of the fabric stretched on the walls and the carving of the doors display numerous images of musical instruments and notes. The frame of the huge mantelpiece mirror is crowned with cupids holding an escutcheon with the monogram of Maria Alexandrovna. Abundant in glittering gilt, the gold parlour bears a remote resemblance to the ancient chambers of the Moscow Kremlin, with their vaulted ceilings and ornate walls. However, the hostess herself used to compare this parlour with the throne hall of Bavarian kings. The parlour played the role of a formal reception room. Standing out among the furnishings of the gold parlour is the gorgeous fireplace. Its marble base is decorated with the figures of caryatids and bas-reliefs. The inlaid panel depicting antique ruins was crafted using the technique of Roman mosaics. All this makes the fireplace look like a grandiose architectural construction. Bryullow's concepts also remained intact in the interior of the White Hall, styled in accordance with classic traditions. It was designed to house formal receptions. The predominance of the colour white in the decor visually enlarges the size of the room. The descriptions of this hall often contain such epithets as huge and colossal. The hall is prodigally decorated with such sculptures of Jupiter, Juno, Apollo and Diana, Neptune and Vesta, Mars and Minerva, Mercury and Ceres, Vulcan and Venus. Flanking the arches in pairs, the statues of the Olympic gods served as sculptural personification of the program of the future emperor's reign. The heavy bronze chandeliers bearing the images of war trophies add a peculiar colouring to the composition of the interior. Nations with monarchies long ago assumed the tradition of making special portrait galleries of the representatives of the ruling house. This practice had not only historical, but also explicit dynastic significance. It emphasized the existence of unbreakable links between all members of the reigning family, who shared one common cause, serving the fatherland. Before the revolution of 1917, the portraits of Russian emperors were kept in the Romanov Gallery of the small Hermitage. Today, some of them are on display in the Eastern Gallery of the Winter Palace. The portrait of Peter the Great, the first Russian emperor and an outstanding representative of the House of Romanov, was painted by Godfrey Kneller, a well-known English artist. The Hermitage has a copy of this formal portrait. The original, ordered by King William III of England, has been preserved in the collection of Her Majesty Elizabeth II, Queen of the United Kingdom. Catherine I, originally Martha Skavronska, a Baltic peasant girl who was taken captive by the Russians, became Empress of Russia by the will and pleasure of her great spouse, Peter the Great. In the portrait, made in her lifetime by an unknown artist, Catherine is clad in a ceremonial dress with a sign of the Female Order of St. Catherine, instituted in 1714. Of the numerous children of Peter and Catherine, only 2 daughters outlived their parents. The beautiful Elizabeth was literally raised to the throne in 1741 by the guards from the Preobrazhensky regiment. Louis Tocqué, the court painter of Louis XV, King of France, portrayed the 50-year-old Elizabeth as a young lady with a captivating expression in her blue eyes. The succession of female rulers in 18th century Russia ended with the reign of Catherine II. The Russian artist Fyodor Rokotov depicted her as an amiable mistress of the vast empire. Majestic bearing, high forehead, benevolent stare. Everything attests to the extraordinary qualities of this sovereign, the only one after Peter I who earned the epithet the Great. Catherine's favourite grandson, Alexander Pavlovich, was trained for his great mission from early childhood. Until the end of his life, Alexander I impressed his contemporaries by demonstrating a strange combination of calculated, cold-hearted self-control with sentimental dreaminess. It was during the reign of Alexander I that Russia won its stunning victory of 1812 over Napoleon. Another grandson of Catherine the Great, Nikolai Pavlovich, became emperor in 1825. He was known for his integrity, straightforwardness, strong will, esteem for power, and his unflinching self-confidence. His tall and athletic figure, his handsome face with classical profile, all this, amplified by his regal bearing, excited much admiration and reverence in those people who had a chance to meet him. Emperor Alexander II, son of Nicholas I, managed to make a cardinal turn in the course of Russian history. His major reform was carried out in 1861. It was the abolition of serfdom that had been the cornerstone of the Russian political system for centuries and an integral part of everyday life in Russia. However, in March 1881, Alexander II fell victim to a terrorist plot. Aspiring to stop the surge of violence and establish order in the country, Alexander III chose to undo his father's liberal reforms. He introduced a series of severe measures to suppress terrorism, which helped to bring relative peace to the country. This emperor looked as large and as strong as a legendary hero from Russian epic poems. Among numerous depictions of the last Russian Emperor Nicholas II, a special place is occupied by his gala portrait made by Ilya Repin in 1895. Nicholas II in this picture looks rather like a meek and humble man than a self-assured ruler. It seems that the distinguished artist managed to penetrate the inmost thoughts of the Russian monarch and predicted the tragic end of his reign. The development of the museum's multiple complex started in the 1760s and 1770s, when the so-called Small Hermitage was built for Catherine II. The word hermitage, quite popular in the 18th century, was usually attributed to small pavilions in the depths of a park or a garden, where those aristocrats who wanted to escape the brutal reality could indulge in various pleasures. Following the vogue of that age, Catherine decided to build her own hermitage, but not in a suburban park, instead in the very center of Petersburg, near the Winter Palace. The elegant and at the same time stately building was not lost beside the magnificent imperial residence. The northern pavilion of the Small Hermitage, designed by the architect Valin de la Mothe, adjoins the Winter Palace from the side of the Neva Embankment. The southern pavilion, designed by the architect Velton, fronts Millionnaire Street. The building's first floor contained a gala reception room, a greenhouse, a number of offices, and a dining room for several persons. Catherine the Great would rest in the Hermitage from her public duties. In the northern pavilion, she used to organize entertainment parties, which were also called hermitages. It was not easy to receive an invitation from the Empress, but to follow the 10 rules of conduct developed by Catherine herself was even more difficult. 1. Leave all ranks at the doors, as with hats and swords above all. 2. Seniority and arrogance are also to be left at the doors. 3. Be merry, but do not spoil, damage or gnaw anything. 4. Sit, stand or walk at your full discretion, disregarding anybody. 5. Speak moderately, and do not be too loud to save the others from a headache. 6. Argue without temper or fervour. 7. Do not sigh and do not yawn. 8. Do not hinder the others from any diversions. 9. Eat with gusto and without reserve, but drink with temperance, so that everyone can find his legs to depart through the doors. 10. Never air dirty linen in public, but whatever enters one ear should leave through the other before it goes out of the doors. Failing to observe these rules, like any breach of monarchic command, entailed unavoidable punishment. From the order to drink a glass of icy water in one gulp, up to the obligation to learn by heart a long poetic fragment from Telemakida by Vasily Trediakovsky. Those, however, who aired dirty linen in public took the risk of falling into disgrace with the Empress. Infringers of the last rule were never again invited to the hermitages. The programme of the hermitages included demonstration of the art treasures collected by the Empress. Possessing unlimited financial resources and guided by recommendations of such experts in arts as Voltaire, Diderot and Grimm, Catherine II purchased magnificent art collections that would win honour to any museum. The first collection of paintings was bought in 1764, now conventionally recognised as the year of birth of the world-famous museum. In the middle of the 19th century, the architect Andrei Stackenschneider radically altered the layout of the northern pavilion. He replaced the numerous rooms on the first floor with a splendid pavilion hall that served for small receptions and repose. Shapely marble pillars, airy arches, gilded moulding, and crystal chandelier pendants, shimmering with all rainbow colours, turned the hall into one of the most beautiful rooms in the Hermitage. The special embellishment of the hall is the mosaic floor depicting heroes of Greek mythology. The 4 marble fountains imitate the Fountain of Tears in the Bakhchisarai Palace. In Soviet times, the famous peacock clock was set in the hall. It was made in the 18th century by the English master James Cox. The clock was bought by Prince Grigory Potyomkin of Tauris from the Duchess of Kingston. The peacock clock won its fame for the mechanism setting the figures of a cock, peacock and owl in motion. It is interesting that when the clock was acquired in 1788, it was completely disassembled. Only 9 years later, the Russian mechanic Ivan Kulibrin managed to assemble it. Its extremely intricate mechanism is still intact and operational, and every demonstration of the working clock always enraptures visitors of the Hermitage. In the 1770s to 1780s, side by side with the small hermitage, the architect Velton constructed the building of the large or old hermitage. Unlike other palace structures with facades embellished with columns, sculptures and moulding, the exterior of the old hermitage is distinguished by its austerity. Its main riches were hidden inside the building, intended for the art collections of Catherine II. In the 20 years of Catherine's reign, the collections of her hermitage expanded dramatically. Great treasures of European art came to St. Petersburg by land and by sea, from Dresden and Geneva, Paris and London. In the middle of the 19th century, Emperor Nicholas I commanded the architect Stackenschneider to start reconstruction of the old hermitage. The ground floor was reserved for the State Council and the Committee of Ministers. On the first floor, a suite of ceremonial rooms was built. The gala stairs of the old hermitage are called the Council Staircase. Near its vestibule, the auditorium of the State Council was situated. In the middle of the 19th century, Emperor Nicholas I commanded the architect Stackenschneider to start reconstruction of the old Hermitage. The ground floor was reserved for the State Council and the Committee of Ministers. On the first floor, a suite of ceremonial rooms was built. Today, the rooms of the first floor house the exposition of Italian Renaissance art, one of the most notable phenomena in the artistic life of Western Europe. The room of the so-called primitives displays the works by Italian masters of the 13th to 15th centuries, with their golden backgrounds created in accordance with the traditions of medieval art. The finest item in the Hermitage collection of that age is Madonna from the diptych Annunciation by Simone Martini, one of the foremost Sienese masters of the 14th century. It is the right panel of a once divided folder diptych. The left panel depicting the Archangel Gabriel is now in the Washington National Gallery of Art. The period of early Renaissance is represented in the Hermitage by the artistic works of the Florentine school of painting. Purity and tenderness emanate from the fresco Madonna and Child with St. Dominic and St. Thomas Aquinas. The fresco was made by Fra Beato Angelico in the 1430s for the convent of San Domenico in Fiesole. A refined beauty and lyricism imbue the Annunciation by Filippino Lippi. Saint Dominic, by the greatest quattrocentist Sandro Botticelli, dates back to the period when the artist was influenced by the religious preacher Savonarola, who advocated the denial of earthly pleasures. The most prized treasures of the Hermitage are the masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci. They are displayed in the two-light hall of the old Hermitage. The Hermitage keeps two chefs-d'œuvre of the great master. Madonna with a Flower was finished in 1478 in Florence. The picture was acquired in 1914 by Nicholas II from the collection of the Benoit family. Madonna and Child was made by the artist in the 1490s in Milan and found its way to the Imperial Hermitage in 1865 from the collections of the Italian connoisseur Duke Litta. An important niche in Italian culture is occupied by the fabulously rich Republic of Venice, whose art is distinguished for its festive brilliance and love of luxury. New tendencies of the Renaissance became apparent in Venetian art only in the second half of the 15th century. Local artists, however, managed to catch up with them in no time, and in the 18th century made the Venetian school one of the leading in Italy. Outstanding masters whose names are renowned all over the world belonged to that school. The famous enigmatic Judith, one of the gems in the Hermitage collections, is the work of Giorgione. His disciple, the great Titian, is represented in the Hermitage by 8 canvases, including his true masterpieces: Penitent Magdalene, Saint Sebastian, and Danae. One of the most talented painters of the Venetian school, Paolo Veronese, is the author of the doleful Lamentation of Christ. The museum grew and thrived under the persistent patronage of the enlightened empress. The only threat to its riches and splendor came from rats. They were quick to appreciate all the advantages of these new apartments. Its proximity to water and abundance of victuals attracted them not a bit less than the luxurious imperial collections. A special breed of cats, top experts in dealing with rats, was found in Kazan. It was this city that started sending cats to the capital, following the empress's command. The cats were guarded, fed and settled for the night. From those days on, they were permanently kept within the palace and museum. And that is how the new breed of Hermitage cat came into existence. Nowadays, they still abide at the Hermitage, in favour and honour, as its faithful and steadfast protectors. The last building to be included in the palace ensemble was the new Hermitage. It was specially designed for imperial art collections, and as such acquired the status of a public museum. The new Hermitage was built from 1842 to 1851. Following the decision of Nicholas I who had invited to St. Petersburg the famous museum architect Leo von Klenze from Munich. The ceremonial opening of the new museum took place on the 5th of February, 1852. The grandeur and serenity satiate this powerful two-storied edifice. The dominant feature of the main facade is the famous portico with 10 figures of granite Atlantes sculpted by Alexander Terebenev. Despite its outward reticence, the interior of the new Hermitage impresses with its truly royal luxury. Nicholas I demanded that in beauty the museum should equal a palace. The grand Hermitage staircase, crowned with a monumental granite colonnade, leads to the first floor of the building, where art collections are displayed. On the upper landing, there are splendidly looking multicolored tabletops, decorative vases, and standing lamps from semi-precious stones quarried in the Urals. They were made in the 18th and 19th centuries by Russian craftsmen at Peterhof, Ekaterinburg, and Kolivan lapidary factories. Their brightness is shaded by the marble statues by West European sculptors of the 18th century. Nicholas I purchased them expressly for the new Hermitage, then under construction. The suite of exhibition halls begins with the Gallery of Ancient Art History. Its walls display over 80 subjects pictured with wax paints on copper plates, imitating the antique technique. They illustrate the history of Grecian painting as it was described by antique authors. Uninterrupted ties between ages are emphasized by the bas-relief profiles of great artists of the past and West European marble statues of the 18th to 19th centuries. Visitors are always fascinated by the famous figures of three Graces, made by the Italian sculptor Antonio Canova at the request of Napoleon's wife Josephine de Beauharnais. Brilliantly accomplished in marble is the complex composition Cupid and Psyche, dedicated to the eternal triumph of love. One of the most popular of Caneva's works is the statue of the ever-young Hebe. According to mythology, it was she who filled the goblets of Olympic gods with nectar. The largest rooms of the new Hermitage are called the top-lighted halls. Sunshine freely streams inside them through the glass skylights, evenly diffusing over the wall-mounted pictures. The upper part of the walls in the top-lighted halls is adorned with gilded moulding. It is echoed by the gilded carving of armchairs and settees, made specially for the Imperial Museum. Vases, candelabra and tables with stone tabletops, lined up along the axis that connects the halls, illustrate the craftsmanship of Russian stonecutters. Articles of rhodonite and porphyry were hewn from whole stone monoliths, while lapis lazuli and malachite tabletops and vases exemplify the Russian mosaic technique. The large and small Italian top-lighted halls contain the works by Italian artists of the 16th to 18th centuries. Once, these large-sized canvases decorated cathedrals and palaces. Many of them found their way to the Hermitage thanks to the active collecting efforts of Catherine II. A widely acknowledged chef d'oeuvre of Italian art is The Birth of John the Baptist by Jacopo Tintoretto, Venetian painter of the 16th century. This vivid and colourful picture glorifies the miracle of a new life coming into being. A stormy commotion of bodies, interwoven in fierce combat, fills the canvas of the Neapolitan artist Luca Giordano. The centaurs fight with the Lapithai. The picture illustrates an ancient Greek myth. The genre of townscape, or veduta, popular in the 18th century, is represented by the brilliant work of Antonio Canale, known as Canaletto, the reception of the French ambassador in Venice. Starring as the main character of the picture is the artist's beloved city of Venice, the mistress of the seas, and the gem of the Adriatic. proud bearing of the victors and the mournful silence of the defeated are united in the monumental canvas, The Triumph of the Emperor, by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, an outstanding Venetian artist of the 18th century. The Italian master Caravaggio is the author of The Lute Player. At the turn of the 17th century, he ventured to depict not an ideal world, but instead everyday reality. Caravaggio's unique creative talent never left anyone unimpressed. Nicolas Poussin called him the destroyer of art, but his numerous followers successfully used his painting methods, especially the abrupt contrast of light and shadow. Central position in the large Italian top-lighted hall is occupied by the sculptural composition The Death of Adonis, made by Giuseppe Mazzuola early in the 18th century. Expressed in marble are the last moments of young Adonis, the beloved of Venus, whose life was taken by a boar during a hunt. The Spanish top-lighted hall houses the works by Spanish artists of the 17th to early 19th centuries. The 17th century was indeed the golden age of Spanish art, when a whole constellation of eminent masters entered the world. Diego Velázquez is rightfully named the first among them. The portrait of Count Olivares, the omnipotent favourite of Philip IV, is full of merciless truth and vital force. It is one of the best portraits in the Hermitage collection. The characters of José Ribera, an ardent proponent of Christianity, seem to come to life on his canvases. Looking at St. Jerome creates the illusion of hearing the sound of the angel's trumpet, heralding the approaching doomsday. The last great artist of the Golden Age was Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. For his tender delicacy and lyricism, he was called the Spanish Raphael. New trends in Spanish painting were opened in the early 19th century by the great Goya. His only picture in the Hermitage, Portrait of the actress Antonia Zarate, is painted with remarkable freedom and lightness. Running in parallel with the top-lighter halls of the new Hermitage is a suite of the so-called cabinets, exhibiting Italian and Spanish art of the 15th to 17th centuries. Sixteenth century Spanish painting developed under the influence of Italian masters. Madonna and Child with a cross-shaped distaff by Luis de Morales is full of grim austerity. Here, the traditionally blissful Renaissance theme of Madonna acquired a tinge of tragedy. One of the masterpieces in the Hermitage's collection of Spanish art is the Apostles Peter and Paul by El Greco. the artist managed to express with the painter's brush two key elements of the Christian faith: resignation and readiness for self-sacrifice. In the autumn of 1778, looking through the coloured prints of Raphael's celebrated loggias in the Vatican Palace, Catherine II desired to have their life-size replicas. Raphael's loggias are excellent and precious articles. The more you look at them, the stronger is the wish to see them. I make a vow to Saint Raphael to erect such loggias, whatever it may cost, and put the reproductions inside, wrote the enlightened empress about her feelings. The task of making canvas copies of the murals made by the great Raphael and his disciples in the early 16th century was assigned to a team of artists under Christopher Unterberger. The work was completed in 1785, after 7 years of labouring. The initial plan was to place the murals in the Winter Palace, but the architect Giacomo Quarenghi suggested setting up a special building near the large Hermitage. The new edifice was raised on the bank of the Winter Channel in 1792. In the 1840s, when the construction of the new Hermitage was about to start, the building housing Raphael's loggias was pulled down. The canvases with frescoes, mirrors, doors and parquetry were removed, carefully stored, and later returned to their places, but in the halls of a new museum. Raphael's loggias themselves represent a 90-metre-long gallery, divided by pillars into 13 equal parts, each roofed with a square vault and separated from the neighbouring ones by a round arch. The vaults demonstrate scenes from the Bible, while the walls and pillars are adorned with intricate grotesque ornamentation. The light and spacious hall of Italian Majolica is decorated with Ionic columns and gilded statues of caryatids. The ceiling, divided into square caissons, is covered with frescoes replicating antique traditions. A picturesque frieze partitioned by gilded stucco figures of young men runs along the upper perimeter of the walls. The hall owes its name to the exhibition of multicoloured ceramic articles that Italians call Majolica. They were made from clay covered after baking with opaque glaze. Then their surface was painted and the article was baked once more. The paints coalesced with the glaze and acquired bright glitter. The hall also displays Italian tapestry of the 16th century. The figure of the god Apollo is woven into the centre of the tapestry. He stands in a circle of the zodiac signs. The remaining surface of the tapestry is covered with elaborate grotesques. A unique achievement of fine arts is the gigantic pictorial cartoon. It is by use of such cartoons that weavers made tapestries. The Hermitage cartoon, Procession with Elements, was painted in the 16th century by Raphael's disciple Giulio Romano on a theme from the history of ancient Rome. Along the walls, there are wooden cassone, decorated with carvings. These coffers were used for keeping garments and also served as benches. The Hall of Italian Majolica has on display two works of the greatest painter of the High Renaissance, Raphael Santi, who was called divine even in his lifetime. The Conestabile Madonna was painted by Raphael, a creator of ideal female beauty, around 1503. Following the wish of Emperor Alexander II, it was acquired in 1870 from Count Conestabile. An interesting fact is that the frame of the picture was also made according to Raphael's design. The Holy Family was finished by the artist in 1506. This picture, full of peaceful harmony, is also called Madonna with Beardless St. Joseph. Indeed, the ancient tradition dictated that St. Joseph should be depicted as a sage and venerable old man, and always with a beard. The Knights' Hall has won special popularity with Hermitage visitors of all ages. It harbours examples of 15th to 17th century weaponry made by remarkable armourers in Germany, Italy, Spain, France and other European countries. A militant glint radiates from the mirror-finished steel of a knight's armour. The armour, made from a great number of metal plates meticulously fitted together, was an extremely complicated product of a whole team of expert craftsmen. It is not without reason that beginning from the 15th century, armour became a specially prided and tended possession of noble warriors who spent enormous sums of money on buying their suit. The weight of a knight's armour varied from 18 up to 25 kilograms. Its shape conformed to the contemporary fashion. The surface of steel plates was lavishly embellished. Some armour, still able to serve as reliable protective gear of a knight, turned into real masterpieces of arts and crafts. As a rule, such armour was not used in battle. In addition to the armour, the exhibition displays knights' swords and shields covered with unbelievably intricate ornaments. Huge two-handed swords, weighing up to 4 kilograms and more, were adopted by infantrymen. The exhibition of 17th century Dutch artists, the so-called Minor Dutchmen, is displayed in the tent hall of the new Hermitage. In the hall's design, an original decorative technique was used, when in a gable roof room one could clearly see the system of roof timbers covered with painting. Pictures by Dutch artists appeared in St. Petersburg as far back as in the times of Peter I. Almost all art collections acquired for the Hermitage in the 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries contained masterpieces of Dutch painting. The artists in Holland, a Protestant country which became independent early in the 17th century, chose ordinary reality as a subject for their works. Their customers were merchants, bourgeoisie, artisans and even peasants. That is why there were so many painters specializing in different genres. The portraits by the great Frans Hals feature surprising virtuosity and seeming easiness of the brush. Although Hals had a lot of pupils, he did not breed any followers. His manner proved to be too inimitable. Most popular with the Dutch was genre painting divided into two themes, the life of aristocracy and of common people. The first theme is represented in the Hermitage by the works of the exquisite Gerard Terborch. Another episode of upper-class domestic life is depicted in A Woman and Her Maid by Peter de Hooch, an expert in interior sceneries. Burlesque and incomparably delicate genre scenes from the life of commoners were pictured by Adrian van Ostade. The Scuffle is one of them. His pupil, Jan Steen, described in his works the life of bourgeoisie and peasantry, tinted with good humour. A separate room of the new Hermitage is dedicated to the heritage of Rembrandt Harmensohn van Rijn, whose lot was a veritable Golgotha, a cross beyond the strength of average people. The talented and joyful community of other Dutch masters humbly retreats before the eminence of his genius. The Hermitage treasures more than 20 Rembrandt's canvases, representing all periods of his creative life. His early period is brilliantly illustrated by Flora, radiating happiness in love and the joy of life. The Return of the Prodigal Son is a masterpiece of his later years, when the artist's soul, according to Alexander Benoit, began to weep tears of blood. Rembrandt is one of the few Dutch painters who equally succeeded in different genres. His portraits provide us with an opportunity to look into the inmost depths of a human soul. His pictures on religious themes are amazing examples of the spiritual elevation of emotions and the vigour of philosophic contemplation. The collection of 17th century Flemish art displayed in 5 rooms of the new Hermitage is one of the best in the world. Most of the pictures were brought to the museum in the times of Catherine II, when Flemish painting was very popular with art lovers. In the first half of the 17th century, Flanders was under the rule of Spanish kings, but experienced an unprecedented uplift in fine arts and, first of all, in painting. There appeared a whole constellation of remarkable artists. Each of them could bring glory to any European state. The leader of the Flemish school, Peter Paul Rubens, developed a unique artistic manner which influenced the whole of European art. The standpoint of this god of artists, as Rubens was named, revealed itself in his tense, dynamic and buoyant painting. His creative scope was immense indeed, from highly heroic monumental canvases, like The Descent from the Cross, to extremely lovely poetic landscapes and chamber portraits. Rubens founded a famous studio of artistic apprenticeship. The most prominent among his disciples was Anthony van Dyck, accepted to the Guild of St. Luke when he was only 18. In 1632, Van Dyck was invited by Charles I, King of England, to work as a court painter. In England, he invented a new concept of ceremonial portrait, which personified the ideal of the English aristocracy and became a model for future English painting. Another apprentice in Rubens' workshop was Franz Snyders. He pioneered the genre of so-called monumental still life, depicting with amazing accuracy and vitality not only lifeless objects, but animate nature as well. Contemporaries called such pictures by Snyders simply shops. The art of Jacob Jordaens is saturated with the atmosphere of a folk festival. The Feast of the Bean King reveals the best features of the Flemish character: friendliness, humour, and overwhelming cheerfulness. Among the rooms situated on the ground floor of the new Hermitage, the best known is the 20-column hall, or the Hall of Greco-Etruscan Vases. In appearance, it resembles an ancient Greek temple. "20 grey monolithic columns from Serdobol granite divide its space into 3 parts. The structure of the ceiling reminds one of the beam and girder roof of a Greek temple." In accordance with antique tradition, the floor is inlaid with coloured marble mosaic. The walls are covered with picturesque panels bearing flat projection copies of the paintings on the Grecian vases. 20-column hall contains items of ancient Italian art and culture. In the 8th century BC, two great peoples met in the Apennine Peninsula, the Etruscans and the Greeks. The Etruscans populated the northern and central parts of the peninsula. They created their own unique culture. The origin of the Etruscans is still a mystery. Their art presents a complex tangle of styles and motifs, borrowed from different nations whom the Etruscans had encountered. Such a mixture was reflected by the peculiar forms of Etruscan ceramics, which show traceable influences of Egypt, Phoenicia, Greece, and even distant Transcaucasia. Following the Greek example, the Etruscans learned to depict people, giving primary consideration to the portrait's resemblance to the model. This was required by the complicated and in many aspects mysterious funeral cult of ancient Etruria. A masterpiece of Etruscan art in the Hermitage is the splendid bronze statue of a young man feasting at table, which adorns the lid of the cinerary urn made in the 4th century BC. The south of Italy belonged to the ancient Greeks. In the 8th century BC, they entered the epoch of great colonization. The regions of Apulia and Campania became acknowledged centers of Grecian ceramics. The gigantic, wide-mouthed vases, or craters, were produced by Apulian workshops in the 4th century BC. They served as tombstone monuments for local nobility. The craters are entirely covered with painting. One of them pictures a great victory won by the Olympic gods in the battle with the giants. Zeus, armed with lightning on a quadriga, Athena with a spear, Artemis with a bow, and Heracles wielding a heavy bludgeon, are forcing the giants to return to the underworld. By right, the greatest masterpiece in the Hermitage's collection of antique ceramics is the Hydria made in Campania in the 4th century BC. This elegant water vessel is richly adorned with gilded relief images of Grecian gods and heroes. Once it had been used in rituals dedicated to the cult of the fertility goddess Demeter. For its beauty, this miracle of Grecian art won in the 19th century the name of Regina Vasorum, Queen of Vases. Among the numerous Russian semi-precious stoneware items kept at the Hermitage, special attention is drawn to a gigantic vase. Its size is such that it almost completely fills up a small room on the ground floor of the new Hermitage. The vase was cut out from 6 blocks of wavy green jasper. Its height is over 2.5 meters, including the pedestal. At its largest diameter, the oval bowl equals nearly 5 meters. Although the vase weighs 19 tons, it is remarkable for the lightness and elegance of form, harmonic balance of proportions, and perfect finish of its stone surface. Written on the marble plate at the vase's base, it states that it was made at the Kolyovan grinding factory in Altai. The author of this project was Abram Melnikov, a well-known Russian architect. The work on this marvellous article of stone-cutting craft lasted from 1829 to 1843. Hundreds of expert stonecutters participated in its making. The disassembled vase was transported as far as the Chusovaya River in the Urals in a special cart drawn simultaneously by up to 160 horses, and thence further to St. Petersburg by waterways on a barge. In 1849, when the new Hermitage was being built, the Kolyvan vase took up its permanent place. Austerity and sublime reticence feature the decor of the halls where the collection of antique sculpture is displayed. Mighty pillars, uplifted windows, marble floors. Nothing distracts a visitor from viewing the ancient statues. Their expressiveness is enhanced by the background of smooth walls covered with coloured artificial marble. The Hall of Dionysus houses decorative sculpture of the 4th to 1st centuries BC, meant to adorn palaces, villas and gardens. Park avenues were decorated with statues of the Greeks' favourite god Dionysus and his companions, merry satyrs. The Hermitage statue depicts the god of winemaking in magnificent robes with a bunch of grapes in his hand. Dionysus stands near the archaic sculptural figure of Persephone Cora. The best-known antique statue of the Hermitage collection, the Venus of Tauris, is also displayed in this hall. Acquired in the 18th century by Peter I, it became one of the first works of antique art brought to Russia. The Hermitage's famous collection of Roman sculptural portraits, the peak of ancient Roman art, comprises nearly 120 exhibits. 4 centuries of personified classical Roman history aligned before a visitor's eyes. The bronze bust of a Roman represents the period of the late Republic when portrait became an independent genre. Made by an unknown master in the 1st century BC, the portrait is remarkable for its realism and tragic expression. The imprint of grief is emphasized by the mourning beard. Maybe we're looking at one of the last defenders of the Republic who vowed to stand up for freedom and wear mourning until the overthrow of autocratic rule. An outright contrast to such impression is offered by the ceremonial portrait of the first Roman emperor, Octavian Augustus, dating back to the 1st century BC. It occupies the central place in the hall, which was named after him and is known now as the Hall of Augustus. The emperor is seated on a throne with a scepter in his hand. This is the way how the Greeks depicted Zeus and the Romans Jupiter. In his sculptural portraits, Augustus was always presented as a vigorous young man, even when he became very old. Such statues were hardly intended to bear resemblance to a living man, but had to promote the idea of imperial might and magnitude impersonated in the Roman emperor. The Hall of Jupiter has on display the largest antique statue in Russia, a colossal marble figure of the main god of ancient Rome, made in the end of the 1st century BC. Jupiter's monumental temple statue, 3.5 meters high, was found in the 18th century during the excavations at the villa of the Roman Emperor Domitian and came to Russia in the second half of the 19th century. Among the portraits of numerous emperors, one of the best is the portrait of Lucius Verus, who ruled jointly with Marcus Aurelius in the second half of the 2nd century BC. An unknown sculptor successfully employed the properties of marble to reproduce in a brilliant manner the smooth skin of his sleek face, fringed with soft curls of his hair and beard. This cannot conceal the inward emptiness of Lucius Verus, a man who liked to impress people with his outer appearance. Completely different thoughts evolve at the sight of the Emperor Balbinus, who was at the helm of state in the year 238 for 3 months only. It was the period when the Roman Empire suffered a deep crisis, and over the course of 50 years had more than 40 emperors. We are facing a scholar and philosopher in the state of hidden dejection, whose main values were peace and comfort. By mere chance, Balbinus found himself plunged into the very middle of political strife, and paid for it with his life. A true masterpiece of Roman sculpted portraiture in the Hermitage is the female portrait made in the middle of the 2nd century BC. Traditionally it is called the Syrian woman. Short of classical beauty, her face is full of charm. The sad glance of her expressive eyes and hardly perceptible smile tinge the woman's face with a sense of bitter irony. One could say that this extraordinary image conveys the common mood of those times, when the invulnerability of Roman might was cast into doubt. Excellent examples of Roman relief work of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD are the marble sarcophagi designed for burial vaults of noble Romans. The subjects moulded on the sarcophagi probably were connected somehow with a man's life and death. The wall of the so-called biographic sarcophagus of the 3rd century AD features the scene of a wedding ceremony held in the presence of gods. The Palace Square of St. Petersburg is counted among the most perfect architectural ensembles of the whole world. Its appearance was moulded for many decades in the 18th and 19th centuries by the talent of celebrated architects and the labour of thousands and thousands of unnamed builders. The first structure in this ensemble, set up in the middle of the 18th century, was the Winter Palace, the principal residence of Russian emperors. More than half a century had passed before Carlo Rossi ventured to build an edifice in the square that could match the work by Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli. The gigantic semicircle of the general staff and ministerial buildings, fastened together by the might of the triumphal arch, bordered the square from the south. A solemn chord was struck when the world's largest triumphal Alexander column, designed by Auguste de Montferrand, was raised in the centre of the square. The glittering expanse of the Neva and the famous Admiralty serve as a magnificent setting to this glorious gem of beauty blended with human wisdom. The archaeological collection of the Hermitage consists of approximately 500,000 items, representing an enormous layer of human culture, beginning from stone implements of the Paleolithic age up to the material evidence of civilizations to follow. One of the most interesting archaeological relics of the Russian north are rock paintings or petroglyphs discovered in the 1930s on the eastern shores of Lake Onega. Drawings of men, animals and birds, symbols of the sun and moon, made 2,000 to 3,000 years BC, were important for the lives and beliefs of prehistoric Onega inhabitants. The nomadic burials found in the mountain valleys of Altai yielded not only articles of precious metals, but also items of wood, leather and wool made in the 5th to 4th centuries BC. They were preserved by the cold, persistent at more than 1,500 meters above sea level. The richest burial was the so-called 5th Pazyryk barrow, discovered by archaeologists in 1949. Under the mound, a timber frame was found with a chieftain's mummy encased in a wooden sarcophagus. Near the sarcophagus, there was a rolled felt carpet, almost 40 square meters in size, bearing images of a horseman and a goddess. Figures of swans made of felt, a disassembled wooden chariot, and mummies of 9 horses wearing masks in the form of deer heads, were expected to secure a safe journey to the other world. There was also a tufted woolen carpet, woven in the 5th to 4th centuries BC by craftsmen of Western Asia. It is recognized as the oldest among all currently known carpets of that type. The East is the cradle of the most ancient human civilizations. All 3,000 years of ancient Egypt's history are reflected in the Hermitage collection of the art exhibits from the land of the pharaohs. Most of the relics were found in the burials of the Egyptians, whose piety, according to the ancients, had compelled the gods to descend from the heavens to the earth. The Egyptians believed in the miraculous power of a preserved image, which could help to conquer death. They called their regally dignified statues the memory of forefathers. Among the ancient cultures of Western Asia and the Caucasus, a prominent place belongs to the Urartian art. The state of Urartu existed in the 9th to 6th centuries BC, in the territories of modern Armenia and Turkey. More than 2,500 years ago, Urartu was destroyed by the hordes of nomads. The academician Boris Piotrowski, one of the directors of the State Hermitage, is deservedly recognized as the pioneer in the Urartian culture explorations. The gem in the Oriental art collection of the early Middle Ages is the world's best collection of silver, dating back to the Sassanid dynasty, who ruled Persia in the 3rd to 7th centuries. Picturing the hunt of the Almighty Shah had symbolic significance in the Sasanian art. The East is the homeland of all the world's major religions. The oldest of them, Buddhism, is represented here by the fragments of mural painting and sculpture of the 5th to 10th centuries from the Thousand Buddha Cave Monastery in northwestern China, explored in the early 20th century. In 1907, the Russian traveller Pyotr Kozlov discovered in the deserts of central Mongolia the ruins of Kharakhoto, a Tangut city destroyed by Genghis Khan in 1227. The Buddhist icons painted on fabric in the 12th or 13th century were found in the excavated burial of a noble woman. The collection of Islamic art is distinguished for its complexity and diversity. It absorbed cultural elements of Iranian, Syrian, Greek and other nations conquered by the Arabs. The Shia artists who lived in the lands of Iran, regardless of the Quran interdictions, inherited traditions of the Sasanian art and continue to depict living creatures. The influence of European culture on Islamic art is witnessed by the fact that in the 19th century there were oil paintings at the court of the Iranian ruler Fath Ali Shah. Traditional art of the Far Eastern countries is penetrated with a peculiar meditative mentality. A peaceful happiness and harmony characterize traditionally dreamlike Chinese landscapes. The eternal immovability of mountains is combined here with the constant fluctuation of waters. Birds sing their beautiful songs among magnificent flowers. The goal of a man's life is to conceive this beauty from the inside and become its integral part. An important place in the collection is assigned to the collection of porcelain, which appeared in China 1,000 years earlier than in Europe. The items, made of nephrite, rock crystal and other stones, are notable for their fanciful design and variety. The art of Germany, represented in the Hermitage by paintings, sculpture and decorative artware, is distinctive for its peculiar German sense of form. Its essence should be sought in the inner intensity and expression, rather than in outward splendor. Among the gems of this collection, the foremost are the works of the great artist of the German Renaissance, Lucas Cranach the Elder. He was one of the first in German art who depicted a nude Venus and created his own unique type of female beauty. Having little in common with antique ideals, Cranach's women appeal to the eye because of their sincerity and touching poesy. The traditional religious symbolism present in his works and his interest in minute details are typical of the work of Northern European artists. In the middle of the 16th century, the National Art School of Germany found itself under heavy foreign influence. An advance of German painting became visible only in the second half of the 18th century. The leading artist of that period was Anton Raphael Mengs. His canvas, Perseus and Andromeda, may be considered a visualized proof of the popular back to antiquity theory. A sense of noble grief and an atmosphere of eternity penetrate the landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich, a great romanticist of the 19th century, whose works came to Russia thanks to the efforts of the poet Vasily Zhukovsky, closely acquainted with the artist. Although the Hermitage collection of the Netherlands painting is quite small, the museum possesses a few masterpieces of worldwide renown. Elevated religious reverence radiates from Roger van der Weyden's picture St. Luke drawing the Virgin, painted in the 1430s. It is an interesting fact that sometime in the past this work was divided into two equal parts, kept by different proprietors. By a lucky chance, both halves of the picture were collected by the Hermitage and, after careful restoration, joined again here in the end of the 19th century. One of the greatest masters of the 15th century was Robert Campin. His creative heritage is represented here by a miniature diptych, the Virgin and Child, and the Holy Trinity. Poor connections with the antique legacy and strong religious sentiments produced a certain effect on fine arts in the Netherlands, where Gothic traditions persisted for quite a long time. Characteristic of the northern painting is the artist's specific attitude towards the world, compelling him to depict with equal love the Holy Child, the fire in the hearth, and the landscape behind the window. In the 16th century, one of the most prominent artists in the northern Netherlands was Lucas van Leyden, showing people either in a simple, unadorned manner, or sometimes with humour and irony. He became a forerunner of the future school of Dutch paintings. His triptych, The Healing of the Blind Man of Jericho, made for the chapel of Leiden Hospital, is untouched by piety. It, rather, looks like an entertaining description of a miracle performed by Jesus Christ. The 16th century in the Netherlands is marked with the appearance of artists specializing in separate topics. An example of that trend is female musicians by an unknown master who worked in Antwerp in the 1730s to 40s. Numerous reiterations of the same subject confirm that it was quite popular with the public. The English art collection occupies the rooms of the so-called reserve half of the Winter Palace, designated for the temporary accommodation of high-ranking guests and members of the imperial family. It was foreign masters who brought glory to the school of British art in the 16th to 17th centuries. But genuine flourishing of the national school of painting came in the 18th century, when England added its own celebrated names to the world's list of merit. The powerful talent of Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy in London, is vividly expressed in his canvas, Cupid Untying the Zone of Venus. At the personal request of Catherine the Great, Reynolds painted the infant Heracles strangling the serpent sent by Hera. The image of a young hero from Greek mythology personifies here the growing might of the Russian Empire. Thomas Gainsborough, one of the subtlest of lyricists, is represented in the Hermitage by only one of his works, but numbered among his best, The Lady in Blue, where the model's spiritual beauty is skillfully conveyed. The remarkable collection of English silverware, dating from the 17th to 19th centuries, contains more than 200 items. Particularly impressive among them are the luxurious wine-cooling bowls. The largest of these wine coolers, weighing over 200 kilos and richly adorned with relief and sculpture, was made by Charles Candler. It took 4 years for the craftsman to cast the design of the bowl in silver. In 1787, the gigantic vessel was exhibited in London before the public, but very soon it was sold off to Russia. By special decree of Empress Elizabeth, this wine cooler was declared national property. Among the collection of English ceramics, first place belongs by right to the articles manufactured by Josiah Wedgwood's factory. The famous Green Frog service was made by order of Empress Catherine II herself. This earthenware set of 944 pieces, ornamented with more than 1,200 landscapes of the Old England, was intended for the suburban Chesma Palace, situated near St. Petersburg, in the area called the Frog Marsh in Finnish. This very name generated the peculiar emblem, a green frog on each of the pieces in the set. More than 50 rooms of the Winter Palace are assigned for the exhibition of French art. The Hermitage collection is justly considered the second best after the Louvre Museum in Paris. The core of the imperial collection was formed in the 18th century, during the reign of Catherine II, when France was the leading trendsetter in Europe. At the same time, artworks from France replenished the palaces of Russian aristocracy as well. However, after the Revolution of 1917, many collections were nationalized and placed in the Hermitage. The earlier part of the French art exposition boasts an exceptionally valuable collection of the famous Limoges painted enamels of the 16th century. Colourful images were painted on copper plates with opaque colour enamels. Each layer underwent separate glazing. Later, painters started to employ monochrome technique, which made the images fuller and more expressive. French Renaissance portraits of the 16th century always win a prominent place in any museum. The portraits painted by Pierre du Moustier the Elder, while still under the influence of Italian masters, already demonstrated the clever calculation and subtle sense of proportion that would subsequently become characteristic of French art. The leading role in the art of 17th century France, where absolute monarchy had been established, was assigned to classicism that tended to contemplate eternal values. In the Hermitage collection, there are pictures by great representatives of classicism. One of them was the dignified and reserved Nicolas Poussin. The works of the painter of reality, Louis Le Nain, for example The Milkwoman's Family, are saturated with epic calmness. In the following century, the French artistic genius invented the lively and playful Rococo style that reigned in aristocratic salons and boudoirs. The founder of Rococo, Antoine Watteau, painted poetic pictures. They were called gallant festivities. The joyful light-heartedness of his capricious woman is balanced in Watteau's painting with the weariness, nonchalance and loneliness of the Savoyard. The works of Watteau's followers, however, reflect only the outer, festive side of life. This is true for the famous pastoral scene by François Boucher, the favourite of Madame Pompadour. The Stolen Kiss by Jean-Honoré Fragonard seems like a captured instant of a careless and frivolous life, full of delights and warmth. The most illustrious proponent of new tendencies that suited the tastes of the Third Estate was Jean-Baptiste Chardin, who managed to show the beauty of the everyday life of common people. The creative activities of the celebrated French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon are represented by a number of works, including his famous statue, Voltaire in an Armchair. Houdon brilliantly expressed in marble not only the features of the aged Voltaire, but also his sharp intellect and inner ardour that the philosopher had retained till his dying day. The statue was ordered by Empress Catherine II, who claimed to be a disciple of the great philosopher. Great revolutionary cataclysms at the turn of the 19th century and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to power breathed new life into the art of French classicism. Napoleon's court painter, Jacques-Louis David, became the most prominent representative of neoclassicism. The only work by David in the Hermitage is his monumental canvas, Sappho and Phaon, where the artist interpreted an amorous mythological subject from the antique literature. One of David's disciples, Antoine Jean Gros, is represented here by his Napoleon Bonaparte upon the bridge at Arcole. The brilliant portrait of the Russian diplomat Count Guriev is the work of another of David's followers, the great Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. At the same time, new trends were gaining strength in French painting, trends based on an artist's immediate emotional response to certain events. Pictures of the leader of the Romantic school, flaming Eugène Delacroix, for example his Lion Hunt in Morocco, are full of passionate emotions. The works by the masters of national landscapes, Camille Corot and Constant Troyan, entice the visitors into a poetic and romantic world of rural France. The country's cultural life in the 19th century was notable for the special role of the salons, exhibitions of the artists whose creative work was approved by the jury of the Royal Academy. One of the most brilliant salon portrait painters not only in France, but in the whole of Europe, was Franz Xavier Winterhalter, who worked on the orders of the kings of Prussia, England and France, the Russian Emperor, and the High Society of St. Petersburg. The success of the academic painter Jean-Léon Gérôme with the salons was determined by the choice of an entertaining subject, technical perfection, and easy perceptibility of his works by the public. This is vividly illustrated by his picture, The Slave Market. One of the world's best is the Hermitage collection of French art dating from the second half of the 19th century to the early 20th century. The works by the Impressionists Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro and Alfred Sisley presented a sort of defiance against the salon art. In their pictures, filled with bright colours and saturated with light, they attempted to convey the momentary impression of what they saw. A similar task, but in sculpture, was approached by the great Auguste Rodin, who was the first among 19th century sculptors to renounce the conventions of the academic school. The art of post-impressionism is represented by the works of Vincent van Gogh, which boil with impulsive tension. His pictures in the Hermitage collection are numbered among the best masterpieces of the artist. The pictures by Paul Gauguin, Tahitian pastorals or Woman Holding a Fruit, exude a serene and meditative mood. One cannot but mention here Paul Cézanne, whose pictures fascinate by their intellectual power and subtle lyricism. Genuine spontaneity and artistic ingenuity became the basic criteria in 20th century art. The pioneer among the avant-garde currents was the so-called Fauvism. Its avowed leader, Henri Matisse, founded a specific decorative trend in painting. World famous among his works are the monumental canvases The Dance and The Music, painted at the request of Ivan Morozov, the Russian entrepreneur and art collector. The artworks by Matisse amazingly combine external simplicity and artistic finesse. Under the banner of Fauvism, the famous Lady in a Black Hat was painted by Kees van Dongen. The same artistic trend was shared by Albert Marquet, Raoul Dufy, and other masters. Later, each of them chose his own path in art. The creative heritage of Pablo Picasso, with his genius for overturning canons in painting, is represented in the Hermitage by his pictures of the so-called pink and blue periods. The famous Woman Drinking Absinthe was painted at the dawn of his artistic life. Two Sisters, or The Visit, is the central work of his later period, the blue one. Analytic and synthetic cubism, marking the milestones of Picasso's rapid and incomparable creative progress, are also represented in the Hermitage collection. Not only West European and Oriental art collections won worldwide fame for the Hermitage Museum, but also its Russian cultural treasures. Some of the items of Russian craftsmanship decorated ceremonial halls and residential quarters of the imperial palace, while some of them were kept in private collections of Russian monarchs. Formerly, the Imperial Hermitage included the halls of the Russian Art School, but in 1898, nearly all the pictures by Russian artists were transferred to the Museum of Emperor Alexander III, currently known as the Russian Museum. The Hermitage kept miniatures, engravings, drawings, and excellent works of Russian arts and crafts. The museum's Department of the History of Russian Culture, organized in 1941, now holds over 330,000 items. The most comprehensive is the collection dedicated to the age of Peter the Great's reforms, the time when traditional values were pitilessly demolished and a new Russia started its progress, striving to be accepted in the family of European monarchies. A noteworthy artistic symbol of these times is the bronze bust of Peter I, created by the court master Bartolomeo Carlo Rastrelli. The emperor's figure, confined in armour, is presented in an unconventional turned position. The sculptor superbly succeeded in conveying the ambiguous character of the great ruler. The huge personality of the first Russian emperor and his variety of interests may be judged by the exhibited articles, many of which belong to Peter I himself. Arms, naval and artillery tools, astronomic and medical instruments. The unique atmosphere of those complicated times is rendered by the items of the interior, lathes, metal and wooden objects, glassware and bone handicraft. The school of Russian art swiftly covered the extremely long distance from humble imitations of West European artists in the beginning of the 17th century to quite independent works of art in its end. The Hermitage collection of Russian painting, for the most part, consists of portraits made by both unknown and celebrated artists. One of the outstanding works of monumental art is the mosaic portrait of Peter I, made in 1754 by the Russian scientific genius Mikhail Lomonosov. This portrait was presented by Lomonosov to Empress Elizabeth, Peter's daughter. The rich and uncommonly diverse collection of arts and crafts comprises items wrought by domestic craftsmen and foreigners in Russian service who found here a new homeland. Furniture and glassware, tapestry and artistic silverwork, carriages and porcelain, magnificent works of the 18th to early 20th centuries, are on display in more than 30 rooms of the Winter Palace. The Hermitage collection of jewellery contains several thousand items made of gold, silver and precious stones in different times by jewellers from different countries. Its best part is exhibited in the specially equipped rooms of the Jewellery Gallery. The archaeological part of the collection is formed by the precious discoveries from ancient burial sites. The earliest relics of the jewellery collection in the Hermitage are items dating back to the middle of the 4th to the early 3rd millennia BC that were found during excavations in the Menshikov burial mound, discovered in the late 19th century in the northern Caucasus. A special place in the Hermitage exhibition is assigned to the famous Siberian collection of Peter I. It contains over 100 gold plaques with engraved animals, adorned with inlays of multicoloured stones and pastes. These plaques served to decorate clothes, weapons and harnesses of nomadic tribe leaders in southern Siberia in the 7th to 1st centuries BC. Recovered by treasure hunters from ancient burial sites, they were presented to Peter I, who had ordered that all unusual findings should be delivered to the St. Petersburg Chamber of Curiosities. In the 19th century, this collection was transferred from there to the Hermitage. The burial mounds of the ancient Scythians, who in the 7th to 4th centuries BC controlled the steppes on the northern Black Sea coast, yielded magnificent gold and silver decorations made in the animal style typical of nomadic art. The image of an animal, whether a predator, herbivore, or a mythical creature, was sacred to nomadic tribes. No less sacred was gold itself, the metal coloured like the sun and never aging with time. The Scythians were greatly influenced by the ancient Greeks, who had been living along the Black Sea coast from the 7th century BC, thanks to the craftsmanship of the old Greek masters, by whom the gold comb from the Salocha burial mound was made in the 5th century BC. We can find out what these warlike nomads looked like. On the famous silver amphora for wine, made in the 4th century BC and found in the Chetomlik burial mound, Scythians are depicted in the process of making a sacrifice. During excavations in a woman's burial mound of the 4th century BC, under the mound of Kul Oba, a whole set of jewellery was discovered, including splendid earrings, a diadem adorned with the image of a snake-legged goddess, and temporal pendants bearing a relief of the wise warrioress Athena. This image is recognized to copy the statue of Athena Parthenos, created by the great sculptor Phidias in the 5th century BC. From the end of the 4th century BC, the steppes near the Black Sea began to fall under the power of a new nomadic people, the Sarmatians. A Sarmatian woman's burial mound of the 1st century AD, discovered in 1864 in the south of Russia, contained a gold diadem adorned with garnets, figures of stags, and a female head carved from amethyst by an ancient Greek craftsman. Among rare items of jewellery, there are articles made by Chinese craftsmen in the times of the Qin dynasty. They amaze with the excellence and precision of their handiwork. A special place in the collection of jewellery is occupied by a small gold bell in the form of an eagle warrior, made in the beginning of the 16th century by an unknown Aztec master. The collection of West European jewellery covers the period from the Middle Ages to the early 20th century. A unique relic of medieval art is the gilded silver reliquary, styled as the figure of a deacon and embellished with gems. It was made in France in the 12th century. Quite popular decorations during the Renaissance period were pendants made from precious materials. They were worn by both women and men. Especially valuable were the pendants with a so-called Baroque pearl of quaint shape. The jewellery of the 18th century is represented mainly by the precious items that belonged to the Russian empresses, Anna Ioannovna, Elizabeth and Catherine II. The countless treasures collected by Catherine the Great even required a special diamond room. Following the invention of the pocket watch in the late 17th century, European aristocrats felt a strong desire to turn it into a precious addition to their attire. So, in the middle and second half of the 18th century, watches on chatelaines were strewn with diamonds, emeralds, sapphires and rubies, and hang on the belts together with a miniature key and a seal. Pockets and handbags of those who belonged to the richest families were loaded with precious trifles, fancy toilet cases or bottles for perfume. The great diversity of shapes and richness of materials are characteristic of the then popular snuff boxes, small cases to keep tobacco for sniffing, which often served as an official reward. In the middle of the 18th century, bodices and corsetry of the noble ladies' ceremonial dresses glittered and shimmered with whole mineralogical collections arranged into magnificently beautiful bouquets. Unlike the bright, decorative compositions of the 18th century, the so-called bouquets of the Fabergé Company, made at the turn of the 20th century, look startlingly natural. It is hard to believe that a daffodil, or a twig with berries, or cornflowers with spikelets, are made of solid stone and gold. The craftsmanship of Oriental jewelers is demonstrated in the Hermitage collection mostly by diplomatic gifts presented to Russian monarchs in the 18th and 19th centuries. Expensive weapons and harnesses also served as traditional diplomatic gifts for many centuries. Precious articles made by Bukharan goldsmiths in the 19th century were presented to Emperor Alexander III by the ruler of Bukhara in 1883 to honor the Russian monarch's coronation day. The unique assortment of Indian jewellery, from the era of the great Mughals in the 17th and early 18th century, arrived in Russia in 1740. This precious gift was offered by the Persian ruler Nadir Shah to Empress Anna Ioannovna. The interdict laid by Islam against depicting live creatures led to an amazing blossoming of the art of ornament. Gold articles made by Indian craftsmen are adorned with intricate ornaments assembled from hundreds of rubies, emeralds and diamonds. The Jewellery Gallery also treasures remarkable items of Russian church art from the 16th to early 20th century. Crosses, icon settings and liturgical vessels are made of gold and silver and adorned with enamels, precious stones and pearls. An extremely rare example of Russian jewellery is the mitre from the great church of the Winter Palace. The headwear of a priest is covered all over with diamonds, garnets and amethysts. In the middle of the 1980s, while the Hermitage Theatre was under reconstruction, experts discovered the walls of the Winter Palace of Peter I, built on the banks of the Neva, just opposite the Peter and Paul fortress. After the emperor's death in 1725, the luxurious building was used as a hotel and even as military barracks. In 1783, Catherine II signed an edict directing a court theatre to be set up in place of Peter's dilapidated residence. However, due to the shortage of funds and too limited term of construction, the architect Giacomo Quarenghi, who made the project of the future theatre, was forced to retain the former foundation and partially the old walls. So it came to pass that the Hermitage Theatre simply swallowed up the remains of Peter's times. Because of that, under the theatre's stage there still exists a large fragment of the elevated basement that protected Peter the Great's palace from floods, and part of the courtyard with an elegant open arcade that once girdled the yard along its whole perimeter. There were times when the courtyard would let in gala coaches, pleasure carriages and carnival sleighs. Under the auditorium of the present-day Hermitage Theatre, the ground floor walls are all that remain from the Russian Emperor's personal apartments. Now the interior designs from Peter's time have been restored there. In his turnary, the Emperor used to begin his working day listening to the reports of his ministers and meeting envoys of foreign states. Wearing his protective glasses, for which, according to the legend, Peter had sewed himself a red cloth bag, he would use his lathe to fashion figurines and boxes of wood, bone and amber. The edicts that ought to be issued under his own name and title were usually dictated and signed by His Majesty in his study. He looked through the papers standing at the massive secretaire, where one can now see personal instruments and inkstands of Peter I. In his rare moments of relaxation, the sovereign would sit near the fireplace, caressing dogs that populated the palace in numbers. Unwilling to be parted from his pets after their death, the emperor often requested to stuff them. One of the stuffed dogs is still on display. The dining room, like other premises, was decorated with landscapes and still lives, once acquired by Peter in Western Europe. A massive candle chandelier and a splendid English clock with a musical mechanism. On the table, covered according to the fashion of those days with an oriental carpet, one can see a glass goblet for serving choice wine, bronze candelabra, a tin tankard, a gilded bowl for cooling drinks, and an earthenware dish with fruits. The presence of Peter the Great in his favourite winter residence is sensed not only in these small rooms, but also in the former guardhouse of the palace, where the famous wax effigy, made after the emperor's death by the court sculptor Bartolomeo Carlo Rastrelli, is now stationed. The largest and the grandest in the whole of St. Petersburg. Such was the contemporary opinion of the palace that belonged to the first Governor-General of the northern capital, His Grace Prince Alexander Danilovich Menshikov. The construction of a stone mansion on Vasilyevsky Island started in 1710, but it took several more years to finish, enlarge and modify the building. Menshikov employed the best foreign architects, sculptors and carvers, including such masters as Domenico Trissini, Georg Johann Matanovi, Andreas Schluter, Bartolomeo Carlo Rastrelli, and others. Peter loved to visit this luxurious and hospitable mansion. The great gala hall of the Menshikov Palace was often used to receive foreign envoys, organize assemblies and masquerades, celebrate prominent national events, or make festive parties for the imperial family. The palace witnessed the fabulous ascent of its owner to the peak of power and his no less precipitous downfall. Beginning from 1732, the Menshikov Palace served as the quarters for the cadet corps, and as it turned out, military training schools would occupy the mansion right up to the 1930s. Notwithstanding considerable reconstructions, many unique interiors of the palace have been preserved. In 1981, the State Hermitage opened in the Menshikov Palace its new exhibition, Russian Culture of the First Third of the 18th Century. Today, as 300 years ago, the guests enter the palace through the great vestibule. It owes its solemn gala appearance to the vaulted ceiling, columns and walls painted in imitation marble. In the center of the vast hall is the bronze bust of Alexander Menshikov. This first sculptural portrait in the history of Russian art was made in 1719 by the court artist Bartolomeo Carlo Rastrelli. The ground floor of the palace housed mainly service rooms, workshops, kitchens and quarters for guards, orderly sailors and oarsmen. One of the numerous cookery rooms in the palace was restored according to the archive records and illustrations of the 18th century. Here the choicest of dishes were cooked for Menshikov's numerous guests. Foreigners who had visited the palace testified that nowhere in St. Petersburg will you find better dinners than at the prince's. The cookery room now contains West European kitchenware of the first third of the 18th century, diverse in shape and made of copper, tin, glass or clay. The large bowl is carved from a whole trunk of lime tree. The oak staircase that leads to the gala apartments of the palace matches the building in height. Serving as a sort of extension to the staircase is the gala vestibule of the first floor. The upper landing retains original stone floors and forged metal railings of the balustrade, where the monograms of Emperor Peter I and Prince Menshikov are interwoven with the ornament. The gala vestibule connects all the rooms on the first floor. It leads directly to the great ceremonial hall, as well as to the residential rooms of the palace, abounding in unique articles of arts and crafts. Restored by the assiduous labour of architects, historians, art experts and restorers, the interiors impress with the beauty of their tapestry and mural upholstery, intricately shaped expensive furniture, items of silver and semi-precious stones, as well as by the abundance of Chinese and Japanese porcelain made in the late 17th and early 18th century. The so-called ante-bedroom served for the Governor-General of St. Petersburg as a reception room. Menshikov listened here to the reports of his secretaries and assistants in city management, received architects, artists and engravers. On the room's walls there are portraits of the owner of the palace and his spouse, Princess Darya Menshikova. The decor of the reception room attests to the high social status of the owners of the palace. The reception room is decorated with a china cabinet, exposing to the guests the best tableware in the house. The oval table fashionable at that time, and leather-covered chairs with a magnificent embossing. Nevertheless, the main element of the room's furnishing is certainly the tilework from the Dutch city of Delft, painted manually with blue cobalt dye. Once the palace contained 11 such rooms, but only 4 have been preserved to these days. There is no mansion in Europe with such kinds of interior, where tiles cover not only the walls, but also the ceilings. All in all, Menshikov's residence boasts nearly 28,000 painted tiles. They depict plant ornaments, landscapes, pastoral scenes, mythological and biblical subjects. The study, also decorated with tiles, displays the paintings of Dutch artists who specialized in seascapes, the marines of the 17th and 18th centuries. On the table in the center of the room, there are a splendid silver-shaped goblet, a globe, and an astrolabe. At the frontal wall, there's a typical piece of European furniture, the walnut cabinet, decorated with gilded carving and ivory plates, which was made in Spain in the 17th century. One of the most remarkable interiors of the palace can be seen in the so-called Varvara's chamber, bedroom and study that belonged to Varvara Arsenyeva, sister of Menshikov's wife. The central place in the bedroom is occupied by a high walnut bed with relief carving covered with an embroidered Turkish counterpane. The tiled stove, dating back to the first third of the 18th century, is decorated with tiles made in St. Petersburg. The room's decor is complemented by cabinets, chairs, an armchair and a toilet table. The icon Our Lady of Tikhvin is positioned in the place of honor, traditional for Russian homes, the corner opposite to the doors. The facing of the ceremonial study that served for receiving most important guests is made of walnut. This is one of the best interiors in the palace. Here the walnut panels harmonize well with the parquet floor and the decorative gilt plafond painted on canvas. A luxuriant cabinet is placed in the very center of the room. It is inlaid with the tortoiseshell plaques and gilded bronze platelets. Over the cabinet, one can see the portrait of a young Peter I by the Dutch artist Jan Wieniks. The carved and gilded chairs, upholstered in velvet, were manufactured in Italy. The amber chess came from Prussia, while the standing clock in a walnut case was brought to St. Petersburg from England in the 18th century. The General Staff Building was erected in the first third of the 19th century by the celebrated architect Carlo Rossi. It gainfully completes the world-famous ensemble of Palace Square. Looking towards the Winter Palace, the facade of this renowned building, one of the longest in St. Petersburg, is emphasized by a stately triumphal arch. The arch was designed with the assistance of the sculptors Pimenov and Demut Malinovsky to commemorate the victory of the Russian forces in the Patriotic War of 1812. The western wing of the building housed the General Staff and other military institutions, while the eastern one was allotted to the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Empire. The ground and second floors were turned into offices for ministerial functionaries. The quarters of the first floor in the eastern wing, with windows opening on the palace square, were occupied by ministers of foreign affairs. The first tenants of these apartments were Count Karl Nesselrode and Prince Alexander Gorchakov. The decoration of the first floor rooms is now practically the same as it was in their times. In the end of the 20th century, the eastern wing of the General Staff building was conveyed to the State Hermitage. The first exposition in 10 restored rooms was the exhibition Under the Sign of the Eagle, The Art of Empire. The Empire style appeared in Napoleon's France and later went beyond its geographic borders. It took root in many countries of the world, but in the Russian Empire, its effect on the national art was particularly remarkable and unique. One of the characteristic decorative elements in Empire-style applied art is the image of the eagle, a traditional symbol included in the national emblems of European empires, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The exhibition introduces brilliant examples of painting, drawing, sculpture, numismatics, decorative and applied art created by masters from different European countries in the first third of the 19th century. The interiors designed by the architect Rossi winningly harmonise with the furniture, which was also made according to his sketches. The epoch of the Empire style is often called the Golden Age of Bronze. Indeed, an empire interior cannot be imagined without the noble glitter of mantelpiece clocks, chandeliers, sconces, candelabra, vases and gilded table decorations. The first place among the masters of decorative bronze in the late 18th and early 19th century belongs by right to the French artist Pierre-Philippe Thomire. A unique masterpiece of Empire-style decorative art is the luxurious set of chinaware. It belonged to Eugène de Beauharnais, the son of Napoleon Bonaparte's wife, Joséphine de Beauharnais. The attention of the public is always attracted by the costumes of the first quarter of the 19th century, displayed in the General Staff building. The costume of a Knight of the Order of the Holy Spirit was designed for the ceremony conferring knighthood of the Catholic Order, founded in 1578 in France. Made in the 19th century, the costume belonged to the Russian Emperor Alexander I. He was awarded knighthood of the French Order in 1815. In 2003, the Museum of the Guards opened in the building of the General Staff. The history of the Russian Guards started in the early 18th century. In the battles of the Northern Wars, the Guards covered themselves with unfading glory during the war with Napoleon's troops. The Emperors Nicholas I and Alexander II did everything in their power and authority to strengthen the Guards. the Imperial Guards, the elite of the Russian army, ceased to exist in the years of the First World War. One more but smaller exhibition presents to the visitors the Hermitage collection of modernist artwork at the turn of the 20th century. The international nature of modernism is accentuated by the clothes, adornments, furniture and works of fine art created in France, England, the United States of America and Russia. Modernism as an artistic style revealed itself most vividly in decorative art and crafts, especially in glassware. A prominent monument to that epoch is the tapestry Adoration of the Magi, made by William Morris, according to the cartoons by the English painter Edward Burne-Jones. Utmost perfection is a distinctive feature of the table decoration, the dance with scarves. It was made by the craftsman Leonard van Wedevelt at the Sèvres porcelain manufactory. In 1901, 15 sculptures from this composition were presented to the Emperor Nicholas II and his spouse, Empress Alexandra, during their visit to Paris. A wide public response was evoked by another exhibition organised in the halls of the General Staff building, Pierre Bonnard and Maurice Denis, decorative ensembles in the Hermitage collection. In 1907, Ivan Denisov, a connoisseur from Moscow, ordered for his mansion a series of decorative panels, The History of Psyche, from the French artist Maurice Denis. Several years later, another French master, Pierre Bonnard, received from Morozov a request for a large triptych, The Mediterranean. Panels between columns intended to decorate the main staircase. These works were transferred to the Hermitage in 1948, after the closure of the Museum of New Western Art in Moscow. However, it proved impossible to display them in the Hermitage rooms because of their considerable size. Now, the decorative canvases and easel paintings by Denis and Bonnard and other French artists of the late 19th and early 20th century conveniently fit the exhibition halls of the General Staff building. In 2003, the first buildings of the Restoration and Storage Centre were opened in the district called the Old Village, to celebrate in a symbolic way the Hermitage's entry into the 21st century. Austere geometric forms make the centre's facilities look reliable and mighty. At the same time, plenty of windows speak about the accessibility of the new repository to the outer world. Numerous storage rooms are provided with special museum equipment and novel electronic systems of security, fire protection, and climate control. The transportation of exhibits is organised according to a strict pattern. All these measures must ensure the best conditions for restoring and keeping the items of historical and cultural heritage. A unique feature of this project is the so-called route of open storage, which allows visitors to comprehend the immeasurable treasures of the Great Museum, to see such exhibits that have never been displayed before, and make them accessible to all the art-loving public. The storage area of the Russian Cultural History Department, assigned for painting, houses more than 1,000 works of art from the 18th to 20th centuries. Here one can get acquainted with the pictures painted by Russian masters and foreign artists who worked in Russia. The Depository of Sculpture introduces a diversity of statues made in the 18th to 20th centuries, monumental and decorative sculpture, and relief works. The most numerous is the collection of classical sculpture that came to Russia in Peter the Great's times and very soon became integrated into gardens, parks, graveyards, decors of royal palaces, manors and mansions of the Russian aristocracy. The historical development of human culture may be followed by viewing the furniture items kept in two huge depositories equipped with glass passages. The diversity of variously shaped pieces of furniture reflect, as in a mirror, tastes, passions, values and traditions of people from different ages. The pride of the Hermitage repository is the so-called Tapestry Theatre, where the handicraft made by West European carpet weavers in the 16th to 17th centuries is displayed on mobile stands that look in some way like backstage decorations. The luxurious marquee, manufactured in Istanbul in the middle of the 18th century, was presented to Empress Catherine II by the Turkish Sultan Selim III in 1793 to commemorate their peace treaty. This masterpiece, with amazingly beautiful inner decoration of gold, silver and silk embroidery, has never been on display in the Hermitage before. Besides the tent is the Garuda, a snake-devouring bird from Indian mythology. This modern sculpture, carved from mahogany on the island of Bali, was presented to St. Petersburg by the President of Indonesia in 2003, when the city celebrated its 300th anniversary. One cannot but feel the attraction of the most spacious storage room containing carriages. Displayed here are the coaches and sleighs of the 18th and 19th centuries that once belonged to the collection kept in the Museum of the Court Stabling Department. Most of these carriages were owned by members of the Russian imperial family. A place of honor in the collection is given to the great French coach, made in Paris in the early 1720s for Peter I. The coach's huge body is covered with gilded carving, bronze sculptures and plaques, silver embroidery, and allegoric painting. The coach was intended for the coronation of Peter's wife, Ekaterina Alexeyevna, the future Empress Catherine I, that took place in 1724 in Moscow. It is for more than 2 centuries already that the changes in Palace Square have been vigilantly watched by the steadfast guards of the Winter Palace, the statues of gods and heroes upraised towards the northern sky. The ancient gods silently gaze from their height above this beautiful city, unyielding and fragile, full of clear simplicity and deep mystery.